let's imagine we've got a scenario that we've put up on the screen like this, because this is just a thought experiment, okay? The algorithm has done something. It's flagging up to this student that, in the last 3 sessions, they're clearly on red. All right, this is bad news, but the student is not happy about this. Okay, there's all sorts of stuff going on in their life. Quite reasonably, they've informed the student services, but the university reassuringly says, "Don't worry, it's just the algorithm." Okay, and of course, this is a version of everything we get when we ring the bank saying, "Why is my card being stopped?" It's just the algorithm. I can't, it's just the computer. In fact, they don't even know why the card's been stopped. Nobody, in fact, may know why the card's been stopped because you've just matched the pattern and you've triggered a threshold of some sort. And that's frustrating in our daily lives. It could be ruining if you fail to get credit, for example, because an automated algorithm has decided you're not creditworthy. And there's growing interest within society in this whole question of what is being called algorithmic accountability. And so I've been trying to tune into the discourse that's going on around big data and society in general, and then trying to think, well, what does that mean in our context? Okay, and I'll step through some examples to get us thinking about that. Okay, so the thought experiment. Well, you've seen one, but here's another one, just so that I'm not picking on somebody else. Here's a social network visualization from an unnamed system. Kirsty and Abelardo may have more to say about this in their talk. Okay, this is the social ties that are forming in a cohort group as they engage in the activities they've been given across a whole range of social media platforms. And there's an exciting story about how we track what students are doing out there outside the LMS. But oh dear. Student unhappy. This makes me look like some kind of antisocial loner. I'm not happy about that. I talk to people all the time. Okay, and the university might say, "Oh, don't worry, only the teacher sees this. Right? The rest of the students don't see this, so don't worry." But data literate student says, "No, I'm not happy about this because that diagram could get out. Right? As a representation of me, you might as well print on a report, Simon is a bit of a loner. All right? You've just done it visually. Data savvy student. Right? But it's okay. Look, it's just a social network algorithm. It's just calculating your connectedness. We know that you talk to other people outside of what we're tracking, so don't worry." Now, in what sense is that an adequate response? And in what sense is that an inadequate response? And why? Okay. So we'll come back to this a little bit later. So here's the big question. What would it mean for the learning analytics field to develop a rigorous account of what it means to be accountable? Okay, backing out, our lives are increasingly pervaded by algorithms. Right? We can do what we're doing right now because algorithms plus code plus platforms are allowing me to stream out to who knows who. We use the internet all the time, blah, blah, blah. Okay, the world's a small place because we've wrapped the whole planet in code with algorithms that run something called the internet, etc., etc. Algorithms are friends, right? Without traffic light algorithms, we would probably never get here in a car. It would just be chaos. Algorithms are my friend because when I bring money over from the UK, I can use TransferWise, who invented by the guys who invented Skype. Money never actually crosses borders. They just find somebody in Australia who's trying to transfer dollars, and they match that amount with somebody in the UK, right? And so they give me a rate, which is way better than I'd get if I went to a bank. If your baby was in intensive care, you would be really happy to know there were algorithms watching those signals, coming off, and triggering a red alert when something looked dodgy. And algorithms are doing good things. Big data for social good is a growing area, right? A few examples of the projects at the University of Chicago. Who could disagree with some of those projects, right? They all sound like the sorts of things we'd like to see happening in our society. But then it starts to get a little bit interesting as well, and a little bit, the smiley face is going now, because we're not sure. So, if you're not worthy of credit, there are now companies developing algorithms to mine your social media presence and figure out whether you might still be worthy of credit or not. Okay? So by looking at the kinds of people I hang out with and the kinds of things I talk about, that could affect my creditworthiness, my health insurance premium, who knows what. If you Google algorithms in Google News, you will just see story after story in the mainstream media talking about algorithms, these arcane things from computer science and mathematics. So the mainstream is beginning to pick up on the fact that algorithms are pervading our lives. People are starting to get worried about their jobs. If you look at any of the work, the report from the Institute for the Future of Work, what does the future of work look like? AI is coming. People who are doing routine jobs will lose those jobs because the machine will do it better. So goes the rhetoric, okay? So we can now use an algorithm to hire more effectively and without all the biases that human recruiters use, perhaps. Well, obviously, no university would start to vet student applications by algorithm. Here's a slightly provocative scenario that I flagged in 2011. Let's imagine that Ali Blogs is applying to study and your analytics system has generated a high-risk profile for this student. It really doesn't look very promising. They're going to be very expensive to take on. They're going to need a huge amount of support. That's going to affect your budget. Right. Are you glad you know all this before you make that decision? Or are you going to feel even guiltier by not doing it? Or, is this the way to go? Right? This is business intelligence in action, right? Okay, that was a fictional scenario. In fact, this has already happened. Unbeknownst to me, this had already happened back in the late 80s when a British university trained to the level at which humans performed, which is often a gold standard, to recruit the way that humans recruited, only to find that they had replicated systemic gender and racial discrimination. Right? So we had developed machine learning techniques that could do just as well as people. Interesting case, and we'll hear a little bit more about that sort of thing later on. If you go to governingalgorithms.org, fascinating set of provocation pieces, discussion papers, and videos from the presentations there, asking what does it mean to govern algorithms now? It turns out to be a very complicated business. Frank Pasquale has written a very accessible and pretty scary book called The Black Box Society. And there's a nice talk from him at the LSE from just a few months ago, talking about the fact that unaccountable algorithms are counting all sorts of aspects of our lives. And that perhaps raises the interesting question then of what do we mean by algorithmic accountability? This is what people are worrying about. And it has two meanings at least. Okay? One is people are flawed. They bring their own biases. They get tired. They're under all sorts of pressures. Algorithms could do a better job. More objectively, more efficiently, and more rewardingly, than a human. And we might argue, as we see learning analytics evidence coming out, that having a 24/7 adaptive tutor that coaches you and gives you feedback and figures out how much you've mastered, no human teacher can do that, right? And there's evidence that these platforms can do better than humans. So they're making me accountable in productive ways, and it's the only cost-effective way of doing it anyway. But it has another meaning. How do we make those algorithms accountable? All right. How do we ask, how is that working? Why did it do that? So Frank Pasquale would say, we've got to be able to open the black box. And it's a complicated business opening the black box. Because who gets to look inside? Who gets to understand what's going on inside that black box? Okay, and we'll get to learning analytics eventually, but these are just issues for society at large, of which education is of course, a huge aspect. So this is why we have this very exciting transdisciplinary field opening up now, where all these different people have got views about what it means to be accountable. You've got the lawyers, because of course if it gets really serious, you know, you might have to be accountable in court, right? But there's accountability in many other senses, and you can imagine the kinds of questions that some of these people would ask. And in fact, we're going to unpack the different lenses that these professions bring to the question of accountability. Okay, so universities are organizations, and in many respects they look like other kinds of organizations that are not educational. And you might try and use algorithms to improve your business processes, like recruitment, like rewarding staff, right? There are algorithms now that will tell an HR department whether a member of staff looks productive. Anybody's alarm bells going off at that point? All right? Would you like to be judged by an, oh, hang on, we already do that. It's called the ERA, or in the UK, it's called the REF, right? Are you a productive researcher? And we could unpick the metrics that are used to define productivity there. And if you work in an emerging field or a transdisciplinary field, you immediately feel got at, because they're intrinsically conservative. They always look at the high-impact journals, which are the longest-standing journals, which tend to be more disciplinary-based rather than transdisciplinary, etc. Okay, we can start to unpack that. In what ways should we be able to critique these? And of course, because we're interested in learning analytics and education, what happens when you apply these to learning processes? So we are interested in learning analytics, and the source of all authority on learning analytics is, of course, the Society for Learning Analytics Research. I'll just plug that there. Go and find out there how we're trying to raise the level of discourse that goes on around these new technologies. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that a human-centered informatics lens is a good one to adopt. That's my background. And that could embrace a whole range of different perspectives. One is the ethics of technology. People have been writing about the ethics of technology for a very long time. There is, of course, computer science. There's data science emerging. There is sort of a variation of HCI, which is human data interaction, starting to emerge, looking specifically at the relationships between humans and data. There's user-centered design. We actually want to create usable systems and tools with a great user experience where people feel they trust the system. And of course, there's learning technology, or the learning sciences and educational research. People concerned specifically about learning. If anything went to court ever, you know, there would be potentially a legal accountability dimension to this as well. And it would be some mix of those which might provide the basis for a case. Okay, so what I'm going to do is step through the lens that each of these brings and look at the kinds of accountability that these disciplines would focus on. So in the ethics of technology, there are at least three classic kinds of critique, right? One's called the ontological critique, which basically says, okay, you've got this new technology. Do the impacts it have, do they match what we currently judge to be good things that happen in the world? Okay. In the world of learning analytics, that will be a question such as, well, we've got a gold standard that says this student's very high performing. Does the algorithm say the student's high performing? Or does it come out with something that we consider to be completely off base? But it might be talking about matching existing ethical frameworks, to the extent that we've been able to define ethics for these kinds of technologies. There's a teleological critique which says, does it lead to consequences that we value? So even if it leads to new kinds of things that we don't currently have, do we think those are good things or not? And there's a virtues critique which says, what are those designers trying to do? Do we agree with the values they're bringing? And what do the stakeholders, the people impacted, what do they think about this system? Okay. So we can bring a classic sort of ethics of technology approach. If we think about algorithms in particular, people are starting to try and unpack why they seem to be opaque. And the first point is not very complicated, that companies don't want you to see it, right? It's called intellectual property. And we might say that's a bad thing. You know, we want open learning analytics. That's the only kind of analytics that will be truly accountable. But of course, at that point, we're ruling out potentially innovation, competition, companies trying to improve their products, etc., because they won't do that if they've got to share everything. So intentional secrecy is a double-edged sword. Technical illiteracy, you know, if I was to show you the algorithm, would you even understand it? What kind of person is needed to actually read that kind of information? And then the infrastructure is getting extremely complex. So Paul Dirisch has helpfully unpacked that algorithms are just part of the story, even in the world of computer science. Algorithms are just the abstract rules. If we're actually talking about an algorithm affecting the world in some sense, you've got to actually implement it in some program. It's got to come into contact with data, and it's going to run on a platform. Algorithms are not these abstract things. They're very, very material, right? The way that a system performs may be a function of the hardware, the code it was written in, the data that was available to it at that point, etc. So it's not just algorithms, even from a computer science perspective. We'll come back to Paul's work, because this idea of the black box is, and Paul and Introna from the UK, he's one of the people who presented at the governing algorithm, are asking this question: where is the agency? Right? So you don't go and look in a server to find the internet. You do not open the black box, see the algorithm, and have the answer. The agency of the algorithm is in the interactions it's having with data, with other systems. And Paul, interestingly, suggests that if we really want to try and understand how algorithms come to be, we need to be actually studying the people who invent them. We need to study how people conceive algorithms, what's going on when they are, what's the rationale that's going on. You know, someone somewhere in Google sanctioned the different algorithms for implementation, right? And we need to basically go back to, you know, algorithms are on the whiteboards of computer scientists and mathematicians' offices. That's where they get created. Later on, they get implemented. And so we need to study how that happens as well. If there's a bunch of people trying to create a learning analytics related algorithm, what kind of people are they? How much do they understand about learning? Et cetera, et cetera. What's the envisaged user experience they have? How does that tally with the actual user experience a student has? They probably didn't envisage a student, like in the opening scenario, where there's a disconnect with ground truth, is what the algorithm's saying. Okay, so a computer scientist asked, what would accountability mean to you? Would say the sorts of things like this. Okay. Well, did the implementation actually stay true to the algorithm? Good question. If I was even able to access the code, right? First question. To what extent could I reverse engineer what that algorithm was doing? Could I test it? Could I maintain or modify it? Because, of course, we're not talking about algorithms necessarily sitting on one box. It could be distributed around the world. It could be interacting also with all sorts of data that we don't yet anticipate. And we might also ask whether, given a system that's running, can we understand why it's generating the outputs that it does? You know, a lovely example, when you ask Siri, where can I get an abortion? Depends on where you are as to what answer you get. Right? So Apple had to suddenly defend the algorithm that gave you certain kinds of answers depending on what state you were in. Okay. If you ask Google certain questions, it will give you different kinds of answers. The great example of the autocomplete that you get in Google, and how that autocomplete embodies all sorts of assumptions. And Google will say, ah, that's not us, that's just the web talking back to you as to what people search for, right? But by reflecting back to you what people search for, you are shaping reality, you're shaping culture. Right? So if you look at the UN campaign around autocomplete, when you type women should, it starts to autocomplete. And depending on which country you're in, you get different autocompletes. Right? Women should not do this, should do that. Okay? They are, as Paul Dirish would say, creating culture with algorithms. Okay, let's go back to the algorithmic staff recruitment. So Solon Barocas, one of the leading guys in the States thinking about this at the moment at Princeton, submitted to the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission quite a scathing critique about the naivety surrounding algorithms. So they have this aura of objectivity, right? But he steps through in this paper all the different ways that algorithms can inherit bias, right? And you know, the big message for us in learning analytics is that every step in the analytics life cycle, it's infused with human value judgments, everywhere, from the data you choose to collect all the way through to where you choose to present it, the recommendation algorithm, everything, right? So, you know, if our students learn anything, as they design these systems, they have to become very aware of the human judgments they're making. And we need our students on the receiving end to start getting very critical about what these systems are pushing to them as well. And that's a good critical faculty for them to be developing as well. I think we want our students to push back and say, no, that's wrong. Because they're immediately engaging with, well, have I been doing what the system says I haven't been doing, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? And so Barocas talks about the danger that machine learning could simply replicate and exacerbate historically disadvantaged and vulnerable groups in the US through, for example, machine learning techniques being used uncritically. So, oops, sorry about the pink thing there. So Barocas talks about training data integrity, model integrity, feature selection integrity, proxy integrity. Okay, the fact that at different points in the machine learning process you can have these biases being built in. I really encourage you to read that paper. These slides will be available afterwards. Okay, that there's nothing more neutral about a machine learning algorithm than there is about other kinds of information and representation. So that's an interesting one to debate. Okay, moving swiftly on. Crabtree and Mortier in the UK have been thinking about human data interaction, the extent to which we feel in control of our data in society. And they talk about accountable data transactions. How clear is it about how I will know whether somebody wants access to my data, whether I can give permission, whether I can check whether they did what they were going to do with the data, right? So some people are very interested in the idea that in the future we will be in charge of our personal data cloud. Huge, you know, technical issues about how one would manage that. But if in the future I carry my data cloud with me and somebody has to ask permission to access it, we need protocols for doing that. And of course we have to deal with this right now with ethics approval, etc. As data becomes more and more social, it may not be enough for just me to give permission. You know, if we're talking about my interactions with 7 other people, perhaps they need to give permission too. And they talk more about collective data ownership and again, agency. Agency. So who is in control and who gets to say what can be done with this data? Okay, from a user-centered design perspective, we are trying to create real applications that real people will enjoy using and learn from. So we would ask questions like, okay, the sense-making that's going on. Who is the system being targeted at? Will they be able to understand what they're looking at when they have this dazzling dashboard in front of them? And could they take appropriate action based on it? I was in a meeting yesterday with a team trying to design new visualizations for students. But rather than diving into trying to think of interesting, cool visualizations, I was really trying to slow them down and say, what are you hoping the student will take from this? What action are you hoping they might actually take as a result of looking at this? And once we understand that, then we'll think about visualization design. Can the user ask the system why it's behaving that way? Can you give any feedback? So you can tell Amazon when it's persistently telling you to buy the wrong kind of book, if you can be bothered to. Right? Do our analytics systems allow the learner or the educator to tune it? To what extent were those stakeholders involved in the design of the process of the system in the first place? Right? So there's a long history of participatory design methodologies where you try and involve stakeholders in different ways at different points in the process. And there's a good literature on end-user programming as well. Right? Most users aren't going to get into the code. It will be inaccessible anyway, but you can give them interfaces to tune the way the system's behaving. And of course, learning technologists have lots to say about this as well, where the questions would not be, as the computer scientists would say, has the code implemented the algorithm with integrity? A learning technologist might also go further and say, well, you're claiming to be building on this theoretical framework, or this instructional model, or you're trying to code the algorithm to match the rubric. Have you done that with integrity? Right? Coding typically means you've got to create abstractions. It's got to be machine readable, of course. That's different from the world of educational research. So how have you gone from a theory, such as communities of inquiry, or reflective writing, or whatever it might be, and how have you tried to formalize that in the code? And have you done that with integrity? What would the professor who invented that theoretical framework say if she or he knew what you'd done with their framework and were publishing papers saying, my algorithms implement Bloggs et al.'s framework? Would they be happy? Would they feel appalled? Were they ever involved in the discussion? Right? So we do this quite a lot, and I think we need to bring in those people who were the originators of those frameworks and get them involved as well. Of course, we would want to ask, are people learning and benefiting from using the system? And of course, we would want to ask, what about the educators? Are they benefiting from using this too? Okay, so no surprises there. All right, so I've given you a whole bunch of lenses that start, I think, to demonstrate the different levels of questioning that would go on when you talk to these different professions and disciplines. Quickly want to step through a couple of examples. Here's a text analytics tool we're developing at UTS, which is designed to give feedback on reflective writing. So not the traditional academic, third person, I'm demonstrating my mastery of the topic writing. This is reflective writing where we're encouraging students to actually disclose their insecurities, the journey they feel they're on, how they feel they're changing as a learner, how they're reframing the curriculum based on actual authentic experience in the workplace. Okay. And we're trying to develop a parser that can pick up the difference between superficial and deeper reflection. Okay, here's another one from nursing. So you can see that middle example there. The tool says, this looks like a pretty good piece of reflection. It's where the nurse says, in particular, it prompted me to question to what extent I as a nurse should recommend analgesia, drawing on what I had been taught about the effective control of pain. The system is going, okay, you referred to the syllabus. This is quite a specific reflection. It's not a vague one. It prompted me to question something quite specific. It just raised lots of questions for me, which would be a more vague reflection. And there's a shift of some sort going on in the student's awareness or perception, right? So that's completely automatic. We're quite excited about the potential here. So the questions one would ask about this are, well, where's this parser come from? Who says this is good reflection? And so we would go through a process of trying to justify why this is based on the best available scholarship about reflective writing, where we go from a rubric at the top there, which is the typical sort of thing that an academic would say. This is a sign of shifting capability. There's an example there, and then what we do is, with the language parser, try and define a pattern which will pick up that. And we try and validate it, looking at the difference between human and machine highlighting of the texts. Try and generate metrics which look at the quality and how many false positives there are, how many true positives, etc. And so that's one account of why we might want to trust this. But it's only a partial account. If we were to bring that whole armory of accountability lenses to bear, we would ask a whole bunch of questions like these, and I won't read them all out, but from the ethical perspective, those are the different kinds of questions one would ask. From the computer science perspective, does the parser actually replicate what the rubrics developed by the expert in reflective writing would have wanted to see highlighted? Is there sufficient discriminatory power? What's not being picked up? We might want to ask about biases as well. So if only students who have excellent English can benefit from this tool, then we've built some kind of a bias in, because the parser simply can't handle poor English. There are going to be issues around consent. Do the students know their writing is being analyzed? There are obviously user-centered design. Lots of decisions have been taken and are changing all the time about how we're going to present this back to the students and whether they can actually act on it. So right now we're not happy with the actionability of the feedback at the moment. And of course, from a learning perspective, who's benefiting from this? What do the students and educators think about it? And we're beginning to build evidence that educators see a lot of potential here. We've got some student reaction documented now, which is encouraging, but they're concerned, as there are concerns as well about what the parser might miss. No one's sued the university yet for this, but if they were to, how would the university defend itself about the rollout of a technology like this? Okay, here's the second example. This is actually from the OLT project that Kirsty Keto is running. You'll be hearing more about that later. We can harvest social network data from the use of external platforms now. That's very exciting. We can map the social ties that seem to be forming when students engage with each other in a discussion on YouTube, or when they retweet each other, or when they blog or rate each other's work. So that's interesting. This is a view that the educator might see. These are the kinds of questions, again, that we might want to ask from these different perspectives. Okay, so the computer scientist is simply looking at the efficiency of the algorithm, whether it's been implemented correctly. But answering that computer science question, of course, is an inadequate response to the question of that we opened up with in that opening scenario. It's just one of the answers that we can give, that we have implemented the metrics correctly. But there are so many other considerations that we would need to take into account. Data science, again, lots of interesting issues. As soon as we start talking about social, as soon as we start talking about student identity, then issues are going to come up around what's visible and what's invisible. Okay, so I hope that gives a feel for how my brain is working right now, trying to understand the bigger discourse that's going on out there, and trying to contextualize it to the particular stakeholders that we're interested in with learning. And so algorithmic accountability may not be quite the right focus, because it's only part of the story. I think it's a very interesting part of the story, but it's not the whole story. From an HCI perspective, from a systems thinking perspective, we might want to be talking more about the integrity of the analytics system. Okay. So, just to wrap up, if you got on a plane to get here, you already handed your life over to a bunch of algorithms. Okay, so let's just remind ourselves that already the stakes are quite high. But of course, it's one thing to fly a plane. It's one thing to control traffic lights. It's quite another to scaffold learning. Right? This notion of transparency and what happens when you allow someone to look in the black box, if they ever are allowed to, is a pretty complex problem. None of us can understand all the algorithms that already impact our lives. What we end up doing is trusting trained professionals. Right? It takes an expert to explain to a member of the public why something happened the way it did, and we generally trust that they know what they're talking about and hope that they're not ripping us off. So what I think we're going to see is the emergence of those kinds of professionals. Let's not just focus on the algorithms. Let's think about where we think the field's going to go. I've talked a little bit more about this in one article on Medium, about how we try and explain where the magic rabbit suddenly pops up from when out of a black box system. So here's my last slide then. How might learning analytics develop as a field in the context of this talk? I think that we will see a new breed of transdisciplinary professional emerge. These are people who know the kinds of perspectives that are needed to really hold the system to account from different perspectives, for different audiences. And they will have a systemic kind of perspective. There is no one lens which really gives a complete answer. I think that the kinds of principles might emerge from this work would not only guide design, they would help universities select vendors. Wouldn't it be great if vendors, as part of their pitch, had to provide an audit of their system, perhaps according to principles established by SOLA or the community, right? That says no university in their right mind should be buying an analytics system if they can't answer these kinds of questions. In academic peer review, right? To what extent would questions like this be to the fore of the reviewers' minds when they're looking at a piece of work? Now, no one paper is going to tackle all of these, but, you know, I would vote for a conference like the LAC conference to be quite explicit about the need to engage with this kind of discourse. And should it ever get to the point of legal deliberation, well, it's not a free-for-all for the lawyers. We might be able to offer them a framework for thinking rationally about what accountability means. Right now, we're trying to train our data science students in thinking like this, because there's this huge vacuum out there for those people right now. And I suggest to you that this is something that we want to think about further. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thanks very much, Simon. It's fascinating. And we'll have a few questions. Here's one. Darren.
Hi, thank you. Fascinating talk. I work in health, and in nursing, the competencies and the re-registration and everything is moving more over to reflective accountability. Yep. And I just wondered, with that algorithm that you were mentioning back, you know, with health and reflection, whether any of the, like the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, have you know, approached your people or whatever to perhaps use an algorithm to be analysing these down the track. It's relatively embryonic at the moment, but and it only happens if you get audited. But
yeah, right. Yep. Do
you see where I'm coming from? In that people will be putting in these accounts, and then it would be very subjective, whoever's looking at or doing the audit. Might they be looking at down the track, perhaps going to a tool that does it? And would that be advantageous or disadvantageous? Because we're people as opposed to robots.
I mean, reflective writing is probably one of the toughest targets to pick, because it's deeply personal stuff as well, and you're interested in whether, you know, what does deep reflection look like? Right? So it's a really tough problem, right? And you know, we're not going anywhere near automated grading, right? This is about rapid formative feedback on your draft writing. But yes, in the future, you might imagine a reflective writing parser being used as part of the portfolio assessment for a professional, right? I would not want to raise the stakes to the point where, you know, your accreditation depends on what this algorithm says, right? which is where we've got to with credit worthiness, for example, right? But as an aid for professional reflection, I'd like to see a human-machine hybrid system working, right? This is not about moving humans out of the loop. It's about using machines to give the kinds of feedback and timeliness that there isn't capacity for humans to provide all the time. Possibly, until someone gets sued. Yeah, Peter.
Thanks for the presentation, Simon. Really interesting. As a remark, I think there's some work in the AI Ed community on open learner models that has a bit of a tradition of topics that you were touching on, at least for the special case of educational learning technologies. And Judy Kay's concept of scrutability and things like that might be quite interesting to relate to this larger topic. The question I had though was, I think you correctly said that the agency and the level of the firm to look for what algorithms are and what they do likely is not on the code phase, but on the during the design phase or the conception phase of an algorithm. Let's say Google's recommendations and so forth. Do you have suggestions or ideas on what kind of representation, what kind of language would be appropriate for sharing knowledge about algorithms on that level that's widely shareable and that people can, access as epistemically accessible, so to speak, for people? What would be the right level to describe algorithms? Because again, there are more technical forms to do that. There may be design languages to do that. What would be the right level in your view?
Well, I think the only way to answer that is in relation to a particular kind of user, right? So, I mean, if a school buys an adaptive learning platform, right, what will make them happy? What should make them happy? So, the school principal will ask her math team to check that they think it's giving the right kinds of advice to the student. And they might simply say, yeah, it looks good to me. That's the sort of thing I would have said. And I don't want to look in the black box, right? But other teachers might be more concerned. And then okay, what does a teacher need to understand about the algorithm, right? So I'm very interested, when we have companies like Newton, you've got adaptive tools embedded in products from Pearson and McGraw-Hill, and so forth. What is the scrutability of those algorithms? Does anybody really care? Because the interfaces are too complex. When Newton sit down with you, I don't think they really expect the academic, the educator, to build the model. They have an expert who will do that with you, right? Because it's just too much to ask, right? And if a student was to ask, then of course you would give them an even simpler interface. And the open learning models community, of course, have been thinking about how would you visualize to a student why the algorithm behaved the way it did. So I don't think it's an easy answer, but you're clearly going to get a different answer depending on the literacy of the user as to what they could cope with. Right? What if a very lively-minded 9-year-old wanted to know why the system was telling them that they didn't understand something when they felt they did? Right? What do you say to a 9-year-old? Right? There's a great HCI challenge. Right? So of course, there is no one answer. It's going to be very, very contingent on context.
Thanks. There's a question from the virtual classroom from Colette Snowden. Where is the place for random, spontaneous learning if everything that learners do in a computer-based space is measured and analysed? She asked the question because there is a self-disciplining process and impact on agency when they know that they're being watched and measured.
Yep. So this is something that we're very interested in at UTS because the analytics work we're doing is specifically focused on graduate attributes. These hard to pin down, in extremely high demand qualities that students are hopefully going to graduate with, whether they're going into the workplace or whether they're going into more study. So yeah, what does it mean to use analytics to promote creativity? What does it mean to use analytics to promote curiosity? And as I and Simon Knight and Karen Littleton have argued elsewhere, it's completely meaningless to talk about analytics outside of talking about your epistemology and your pedagogy and your assessment regime. The assessment regime is what drives everything, right? That's what drives teacher behavior, it's what drives student behavior. If the assessment regime cares only about certain kinds of things that don't value creativity, don't value curiosity, have no room for open-ended projects where the educator doesn't even know what the outcome might be, well then we're going to be using analytics to turbocharge the current paradigm. And that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do because we need to improve maths and English and so forth. But we have to be very aware that analytics will be used simply to add go faster stripes to the current educational paradigms, rather than perhaps shifting towards new kinds of progressive pedagogies which are more fit for purpose for our times. So yes, when you turn record on and students know they're being watched, unlike a gene or unlike a particle in the Large Hadron Collider, monitoring those things isn't going to really change their behavior, right? We can use certain kinds of algorithms. Oh, hang on, we got a flipping quantum physicist here. Yes, it would. Okay, right, but in many areas of science, studying the phenomenon doesn't change the way it behaves. But of course, as soon as we start talking about people, you get into a reflexive loop, right? I now know you're tracking this, right? So we immediately have to ask, okay, so now students will start to game the system. How do you can't stop students from trying to game the system, right? If you're tracking me, it means you care about this, so I'm going to get busy with my clicks, right? So how do we design analytics where gaming the system is educationally productive, right? I want you to try and figure out the rules because that's part of what I'm trying to teach you. I want you to game the writing tool because if you learn to game it, you've figured out what the rubric is for good reflective writing, at least as far as we've defined it. That's not the same as claiming this tool can assess all human qualities in writing, but we're trying to teach you some building blocks for good academic analytical writing, for good deep professional reflection, right? If you can figure out how to make your text light up, you've learnt something. There's no grade associated with this. It's about rapid formative feedback on your draft writing. If you want to disagree and push back against the tool and say, no, I am being deeply reflective here, no, I am engaging with my peers, it's just invisible on the social network, that's good, that's okay. That should be the kind of mindset that we are instilling in the students. And so it's a great question, it's the one everybody asks, but how we design analytics that exploit the gaming of the system seems to me to be a really interesting question. Because students will, because they're creative and they want to look good.